Hello everyone and welcome to Penguin Book Club. This is a place to come and delve into all those classics you always wanted to read. And today we take a trip to the malls and step into the pages of Charlotte Bronte's Jane Eyre. I'd like to firstly welcome Susannah Fullerton as our resident Queen of the Classics at Penguin Book Club. Susannah Fullerton has been president of the Jane Austen Society of Australia for the past 18 years. She is also patron of the Kipling Society of Australia, a founding member of the New South Wales Dickens Society and of the Australian Bronte Association, and a member of the Dylan Thomas Society of Australia. Susannah is Sydney's best-known lecturer on classic novels. She lectures regularly at the Art Gallery of New South Wales. Welcome, Susannah.
Hi.
We'd also like to welcome members of the Australian Bronte Association today. I'd like to welcome Sarah Burns, who's the current president of the Australian Bronte Association, past president Christopher Cooper, and committee member Annette Harmon, and fellow club members out there watching over the live stream, welcome. And don't forget to pop your questions into the comments and we'll do our best to get them during the hangout. So Jane Eyre. Jane Eyre is the story of a young orphaned girl who lives unhappily with her aunts and cousins, the Reeds, at Gateshead Hall, and she's sent to a boarding school, and after her time there, Jane becomes a governess at a country house called Thornfield, owned by the bruising Mr. Edward Fairfax Rochester. And this is where our drama ensues. Love, loss, deceptions, finding oneself, and ultimately the triumph of the human soul and its various storylines. Susannah, why don't you kick us off today at Penguin Book Club?
Well, Jane Eyre was published in 1847, and Charlotte Bronte sent her manuscript to a London publishing firm. And the very first reader picked it up, began to read, and was immediately hooked. He took it home with him. He stayed up all night until he had finished reading Jane Eyre. And when the novel was published soon after that, so many other readers had the same response. Everyone was talking about the book. It was also controversial. People didn't know who the author was. It was published by Currer Bell. This could be a man, it could be a woman. Nobody was quite certain, so there was lots of debate about the authorship of this novel. But it certainly gripped the attention of the reading public from the very beginning. So Jane Eyre has remained in print ever since. It's been filmed, it's been sequeled, it's been discussed, it's been adapted in so many different ways. This is a wonderful classic novel that continues to give enormous pleasure today. Now, one of the things when the novel first came out was wondering about the author. And of course, we now know a lot more about Charlotte Bronte, and we know that a lot of the novel was based on events in her own life. But how much of this is actual fact from her life, and where did Charlotte embroider when it came to the story of Jane instead of the story of Charlotte herself? Christopher, where do you think Charlotte has done a bit of embroidery or has made changes, or what were some of the areas that got people very upset when the novel first came out?
Well, it was interesting that although she didn't refer by name to the Cowan Bridge School that she attended, very quickly after the publication of Jane Eyre, people kept saying, "Oh, well, that's obviously Cowan Bridge School." The description fitted so neatly. So there must be a certain amount of truth in it being the Lowood being the Cowan Bridge School. But of course, the Reverend Carys Wilson, who was the director of that school, got very, very upset. And
you would do.
and then when Charlotte died, and Mrs. Gaskell wrote her wonderful biography, the controversy flared up again because Mrs. Gaskell made it very clear that Lowood was Cowan Bridge School, no doubts about it. In fact, she had to, in a later edition, had to sort of tone down things to some extent. And there was a debate in the papers, a series of letters. On the one hand, Arthur Bell Nichols, Charlotte's husband, writing on Charlotte's behalf, this was after Charlotte died, defending Charlotte's, the accuracy of Charlotte's account, and the son of Carys Wilson writing, to say that it wasn't like that at all. And he drummed up a lot of support from past pupils who said, it was a lovely school. And in fact, some of those pupils attended it a couple of years after Charlotte did, and I think the school did get its act together.
It improved.
It improved. They did move it. I mean, there was the terrible typhoid, and it was perhaps the position of the school in a valley beside a river, very damp. They did move it in fact, that's something similar is referred to in the novel. And the school has renamed itself Casterton School, Casterton Girls' School, a private school which still exists today. And on their website, they proudly announce that this is the school that Charlotte and Emily attended.
And we hope that the food and the conditions have improved a little bit since Jane Eyre's day.
Of course, the other tie-in as well was the fact that, Charlotte's sister, was ill from being at the school and died, very much in the vein of Helen Burns in this book. So I think that's always been a tie-in back to that school. And
well, both the sisters, both her elder sisters, Maria and Elizabeth, both died. And it's interesting that Helen Burns is supposed to be the counterpart of Helen Burns, and it's interesting that Elizabeth was also the actress whose first big role was playing Helen Burns, Elizabeth Taylor, in one of the very early versions.
Yeah. So Cowan Bridge was one of the controversies connected with the novel, but interestingly, another controversy was connected with the character of Jane Eyre herself being so strongly feminist. And one of the lines that really upset Victorian readers comes at the end of the novel, when Jane says, right at the end, "Reader, I married her." Now, Victorian readers didn't like that. They felt that females ought to be more passive and that the line should have been, "Reader, he married me." And it really upset people that Jane was so strong, so feisty, and such a feminist heroine. So, Annette, do you think that this is a novel that is quite revolutionary when it comes to its portrayal of women for that time?
I think we have to go back and realise that we're dealing with 1847, and it was a very patriarchal world. And the amazing thing about what Charlotte Bronte does is she presents a female romantic individual and traces her development from what is a horrific childhood through to that moment where, "Reader, I married him." And you have that strong, assertive female individual voice at a time when society wasn't, as you've alluded to, just wasn't comfortable with that. So I think there's a lot of exploration of what principles does society have, what characteristics do people have in this society, and Jane Eyre, little, plain, the sort of person you'd overlook if you saw her, has this passionate hidden fire that comes through so strongly. So yeah, I think it was a very revolutionary book for its time.
It also upset quite a few readers that the heroine was not beautiful. Jane is plain, small, insignificant looking. She has no fortune at the start of the novel. She has no parents. She has no relatives or family to help her. She's in a terribly difficult position. But in spite of all of those disadvantages, she really makes something of herself and becomes, I think, gains such a very strong sense of who she is, doesn't she, throughout
the course. That incredible declaration, "I am no bird and no net ensnares me. I'm a free human being with an independent will." And you're sort of like, wow. Really quite an incredible moment when she claims her place by Rochester. And and really, as you say, not very common in those times.
No.
And I think,
of course, Rochester is not a handsome hero either, so she's breaking the mould there by not having a handsome hero for her novel. Sarah, how did you first react to Mr. Rochester when you first read the book as a teenager?
I found him a bit frightening at first, a much older man, a younger girl, and he had all this mystery about him, but, as we go through the story, and maybe when we age as well, he becomes far more appealing. And the wonderful film versions, even Timothy Dalton, who's not my favourite, had a twinkle in his eye, so he becomes much more appealing.
And of course, we get the contrast, don't we, between Mr. Rochester, who's ugly, we're told, and then, of course, the exceedingly handsome St. John Rivers. But do any female readers ever fall in love with the handsome St. John?
No.
Why not? Why don't we fall in love with St. John? Just like Jane, who, of course, doesn't fall in love with him either. What is it about him that repels us as readers?
The insane passions that Rochester has. That makes you sort of like, wow, imagine being loved like that is the opposite in St. John. He's so cold.
There's no passion.
Well, he's so busy repressing his passion, I think, which is not attractive. And Rochester is very much out there, passionately loving Jane in a way that St. John, suppresses entirely and sees her as basically a helpmake to be a missionary to him in India.
There's that awkward kiss they have, when they're that scene with each other, and it's all very wrong.
There's nothing awkward about Rochester kissing her.
No.
He crushes her in his arms and bruises her with his kisses.
And yet we have to remember that for some reason, the very last page of Jane Eyre dedicated to, or describes what a wonderful Christian he is. So although she wasn't romantically inspired by him, she really thought a lot of him.
He was a good man.
Yes. And this is a very Christian novel, isn't it? How do you think a modern young reader in our really pretty non-Christian society today responds to a book with as much religious content as Jane Eyre?
I think they ignore it, Sarah, and concentrate on the wonderful plot line and the relationships between Jane and Rochester. So I think most of the time people don't see it, but when we go back to the year of 1847, Charlotte is dealing with very topical issues of her day. She's dealing with principles, she's dealing with what happens in schools, what is good teaching about, what is, being a good student about, as we see with Adele, her charge as a governess. And there's a whole lot of what is worth learning, what impact does this have on people that she's really thinking about. So it's a wonderfully rich story which covers so much that's relevant to us today. But it is a very different time.
Well, of course, a lot of those things are matters of principle, not just matters of religion. So that makes them just as relevant to us today as they were in 1847.
Yeah.
The language is different. Fire and brimstone, we don't use those words now. It's a totally different perspective. So that would be foreign to most young readers.
Yes. And many young readers might find Charlotte's long sentences and very involved syntax and her use of language quite daunting when they first start to read Jane Eyre.
But I do think that there's a lot of very modern themes in this book that a lot of readers today would actually would find quite familiar. It's a strong female character. It is those passions, and it is sometimes, going against the grain and still coming out on top, and the universe.
Timeless.
It's timeless.
Yes. And the ill treatment of children, children who are in institutions, who are under the care of other people, that is, of course, just as relevant today as it was in Charlotte's day. And it's so vividly drawn. I mean, those Lowood scenes are wonderful scenes in the book, aren't they? They're just so memorable and so vivid, with the portrayal of the cold and the hunger and the beatings, and they're quite violent scenes in the novel, but they're certainly very memorable. What about some of the other characters in the novel? Do any of you have favourites amongst some of the minor characters in the book?
Well, Mrs. Fairfax.
Mrs. Fairfax?
Yes, I mean, she's a very sensible lady, and yes, probably. I mean, she plays a similar role to Nellie Dean in Wuthering Heights, but I think she's she's older and she's sort of more like a mother figure to Jane, I think.
Which is something she's lacked terribly in her life. Yes.
I think Grace Poole is really interesting, but a lot of movies or TV versions kind of shove her aside. But in the book, she's like this intriguing sort of mystery and ties this, this story together in that midsection of the book, and I always find her quite fascinating.
Rochester blames all the trouble on her being drunk when she's hit the bottle. That's when Bertha escapes.
If I had Grace Poole's job, I think I'd get drunk too. I think it would be a very hard job.
But I think Rochester was very kind to Bertha not to send her to an institution and to keep her at home. And I think, Bedlam was a real prospect for Bertha, and having Grace looking after her in, admittedly difficult circumstances was a very kind act on his part, and shows that there is more kindness in Rochester than, at first we might see. So, yeah.
In Rees's novel, Wide Sargasso Sea presents a rather harsh picture of Rochester.
Yes.
But yes, I agree with you. I think he's trapped into a marriage. Charlotte shows that he knew very little of his bride. Money plays a very big role. He's forced into the marriage by his family, barely knows her. Then, of course, finds that she's a lunatic, and he cares for her in the best way possible.
He does. He does.
And he dumped her into a dreadful Victorian lunatic asylum. She might have died within a few years from the dreadful conditions, and then would have been freed from her. But he also has his sense of duty, and I think it comes through in his treatment of Bertha.
Yes.
But that's the tragedy of Rochester, isn't it? That he's actually a good man, and the many acts he commits to hurt people, he feels justified in doing, because he feels like it wasn't fair what happened to him. He's doing the right thing by her, and damn it, he's going to be happy with Jane.
He was taking Adele on. That wasn't his child.
That's a very good point. Yes. And she's almost certainly not his child, but he cares for her, he gives her an education, he gives her a good start in life.
Yep.
Sorry, Christopher.
Ironic. Yes, it was ironic that Charlotte dedicated this novel to Thackeray.
Yes.
Not realising that Thackeray had to put his wife away in similar circumstances.
Yes, and she meant it as such a compliment to him, but of course he was appalled.
Yeah.
She would have been mortified.
Yes. It was a great faux pas. What about the ending of the novel? I mean, Charlotte ties things up very nicely at the end by making sure that when Jane flees from Rochester, she lands on the doorstep of her cousins. She inherits a fortune which she kindly shares with her cousins. And then, of course, right at the very end of the novel, Mr. Rochester regains some sight. Is all of this part of the Victorian novel convention, and do we as readers just accept it, or should we be questioning the happy ever after aspects at the end of the novel?
I think she. Oh, sorry. I think she balances that wish fulfillment beautifully. And yes, they became conventions after Charlotte wrote. But when she was writing, remember, it is the early part of the 19th century. These things are new in a way that, a few years later, they really weren't. So I think she does have a beautiful balance of revealing to us this individual's progress through life, and how, yes, some of the things may be conventions, particularly later on, but at the time, I think they were newer. Yeah, sorry.
Who says a good story can't have a happy ending? It seems a very modern thing to always end in tragedy. I love a good ending.
I like it.
In Villette, does she? I mean, she has the terrible ending in Villette, so, it's...
Yes, true.
Yeah, she does. Yes.
Oh gosh.
But ending the story with them being on equal terms is so important. It begins when she's even less than a servant because she can't earn her keep. But in the end, they're two equal partners, and
Yeah.
equality is very important.
And it's
Yeah.
interesting that she declares her equality when she's,
Yes.
But it's really only when she inherits money that equality, becomes very actual, and that's when Charlotte chooses to sort of bring them together, is when she also not only can declare her equality but has financial equality.
So it makes it a very modern marriage. Our modern concept of marriage is a union of two equals. And but in the Victorian era, if she hadn't let Jane inherit a fortune, it just wouldn't have been believable that they could possibly be equals.
Yes. Yes.
Very true.
She's also doing, I think, something very unusual with portraying Jane as a child through such a large chunk of the novel. Dickens, of course, does that with David Copperfield, but I think that came out a year or so after Jane Eyre. And so this is something quite different in literature, to show the importance of childhood and how the child is formed into the adult that they become. So you see all these influences on Jane, loss of parents, the bullying of her horrible cousin John, the spoiling of the two little girls of the family, Georgiana and Eliza, the total neglect, even by the servants really, of Jane when she's young. And then when she becomes the child at Lowood, and she's got absolutely nobody to protect her or look out for her, except herself. She has to look after herself and make her own way in the world. And I think Charlotte was doing something really new and important in literature by showing her heroine as a very little girl. And that's a wonderful part of the book.
Yeah, I think at Lowood, Miss Temple is a really interesting character because she works within her province, which is the schoolroom, and I always think it's very interesting how different Victorian schoolrooms were to ours, where you had girls of all different ages in the one room, all doing different subjects together. I think Miss Temple works very well to bring out the best in her pupils that she can, such as Helen Burns, such as Jane. And I think this is another aspect of Charlotte that we do overlook. It's not until 1870 that education is regulated in England, and you have a variety of schools in Jane Eyre. You have Lowood, you have the village school that Jane herself runs, with St John Rivers as a sort of superintendent. You have the governess, figure that she is at Thornfield, and you actually have a substantial range of schooling for young females, as well as what happens to the older females who are the teachers. And as remember, Miss Temple, she gets married and off she goes and starts again. And Jane, in that afternoon, remember, everything changed at Lowood. And so she then decides to, advertise and become a governess and ends up in Thornfield. So it's quite interesting, the role that education and that Charlotte herself was involved in. It's so strongly in the novel. Yeah.
I think we can all agree. I think we can all agree it's an incredible story.
It is.
Incredible story. And I know that we're all talking so much about it because we're all passionate about it, and that's what I love about Jane Eyre. It certainly inspires that passion.
Yes.
So I really want to thank you all for being here today, for sharing book club with us, and Susanna, as always, so incredible to hear your insights, our queen of the classics.
It's a great novel, and if people haven't reread it recently, can I recommend that they pick it up again or listen to it on audio version, which is a great way to experience it. But it's a book you absolutely have to go back to. It's just wonderful.
Thank you so much, Susanna. Our next book club will be on the 1st of August, and we really look forward to seeing you then. And we'll be reading George Eliot's Middlemarch. So pick up your copies and get reading for next book club. And we look forward to seeing you then. Everyone, thank you so much for joining us again. All those watching, thank you. And I hope you've had as much fun as we have talking about Charlotte Bronte's Jane Eyre.